We are recording, just so you'll know, but it doesn't get anybody's face, it just gets voices. So, hey, Rod, good to see you. Judy. So we're gonna get started on time because I like to do that. And I'm up here, so I get to start on time. Had a great week that I want to tell you about, but first I'm going to start with going back to the previous set of lessons that we had before this. It was on spiritual beings and so forth. So most of you, or many of you in the class, were here for that. So what is the difference between false gods and idols? That's what I woke up thinking this morning. What's the difference between false gods and idols? It's kind of a big deal, actually. It's one of the reasons Ken was talking to us for months at a time, spiritual beings. So what's a false god?
Anything you worship.
Anything you worship. Are false gods real? They can be. They can also be imaginary. So you have two kinds of false gods, real and imaginary. Real ones have power. They have a lot of power in some cases. So we don't want to do that. So what's the difference between that and an idol?
Well, something you make.
An idol is something you make.
Graven image.
That's half of it. Good. You got the easy half. Yeah.
An image bearer.
An image bearer. It's a representative of the false god. Yeah. So if you think about it, a false god is a who, and the idols are the what. It's what you would worship. And that's kind of important because as we get into the slides today, and I don't know why it doesn't do that. If you think you're annoyed with this, you should be me. So always we start off with the same slide that it changes a little bit from week to week. One of the objectives of this class is to persuade you and keep persuading you we are in a war. And if we lose this war, we become slaves. So the dependency masters, that I call that, are essentially the false gods. They are the who. And they are spending enormous resources, trillions of dollars. If you look at the budgets of these people, it's crazy. So dependency masters would be people like Google, the Republicans and Democrats, any politician, any newscaster that's trying to get your mind thinking the way they want you to think, marketing people, on and on. So it's a whole host of things that comes to it. And they use idols. So the acronym AIDLS is similar to the idols. So what would those be? We talked about it. We have one whole lesson on artificial intelligence, devices, luxuries, and sexploitation. False gods and idols. And that's the war. We are our own worst enemies in this battle because we're self-centered already. But we have no control us by making us hyper self-centered. So that's the background of this time. Relationships are going to be one of the ways this is played out. I think there's two big battlefields. One of the battlefields is relationships. The other battlefield is economics. So next week we have a guest speaker who's going to talk about economics of this war that's coming and jobs and things like that. Because usually when I start talking about this subject to people, they immediately talk, am I going to lose my job? Is my husband going to lose his job? My wife? And it immediately goes there for people, and rightly so. So we're blessed in this church to have some incredibly smart business people. And one of them is going to speak to us next week. He's been studying this really hard, and he and I've been going back and forth. If this concerns you, if you have a job, want a job, need a job, your kids, anybody you know, please come because he's going to address that. So we'll be doing that next week. So relationships are the other battleground that we're going to start there very shortly. And also the good news is I believe this is the biggest opportunity the church has ever had. And the reason why is because we know how to fight this war. We've never had to fight it before, but we know how. So we have something to offer the world that nobody else has. And this is what I used AI to draw because I can't draw. This is the idea that the foundation of what we're talking about starts with having a good image of God. First verse in the Bible, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's our foundation. Below that is what we're going to start talking about today. Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And that's going to be important because if I'm telling you that this is a war basically to the death or to slavehood, we need to have a vision of Jesus Messiah that is so powerful that we're willing to fight behind him. So the next whole bunch of weeks is going to be getting to that vision of Jesus Messiah. We'll talk about that more. Where we will go from that, truth is known from the Bible. The Messiah will prevail through his church. And that's something we don't talk about enough. But we're going to talk about that. We live in a very individualistic world. Or what am I going to do? In the end, Jesus says he's going to prevail through his church. So we will spend a lot of time on that in a way probably you've never heard. And then Messians are to be disciples. A Messiah is somebody who believes in Jesus Messiah. I separate that from Christians, and you'll see why. It's not that they should be different, but they kind of are. So we'll be talking about that. I love Mitch's sermon. It's always makes me laugh. But then I was like, oh, we fit again. Thanks, Mitch. Great job. And so he brought up the idea one of the ways you fight this battle is to be still and trust God. Another way is different. Nehemiah 4:14 is one of the verses we will eventually memorize in here, but I'll point it out as you stand while I read Nehemiah 4:14. Thank you. This is when Nehemiah and his people are facing genocide. After I looked these things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. That's the deal. How hard are we willing to fight? So we're going to get there. That's one of the reasons why having the vision of Jesus Messiah to be so powerful is important. Thank you, everybody. So one of the things I like to do is start off with a recent article or something I've read that's on the popular press. This one is from an article titled Chatting with God. And it talks about how tens of millions of people are turning to AI-powered religious apps that mimic conversations with clergy or God. So isn't that interesting? We're going to talk about God with machine, not with other people. It's more chatbots offer people the instant personalized support that clergy can't always provide. Now, I love Mitch, but Mitch isn't available to 1,500 people 24/7. Chatbots are. So in one sense, that's a good thing. We have the ability to do that. It's more low risk to reveal yourself to chatbots instead of a person. You'll talk to people, whatever reason, will reveal anything about themselves to a chatbot or to AI. While they are seemingly all-knowing, they are only aggregated knowledge published on the internet. This is a big concept to think about. What you're getting when you get back from AI is you're getting the average of all the knowledge that's on the internet. It's accessing everything it can access, kind of just trying to average it out, and that's the answer you get. One expert says, I believe this is a new way of approaching faith. This is where a lot of people are headed. Now, when we're worried about becoming slaves to AI, and that's where we're going to put our faith, seems like that's the wrong direction, pretty much to go. This is one of the quotes that drives me. This was from an expert on a podcast that I heard. If you can think of it, it's probably going to happen.
Question. While those people are using chat AI, they are at least thinking about God, which they probably never did before. Isn't that a good thing?
Isn't that a good thing? the answer is some of this is good and some of it is a slippery slope.
But at
So
least they're thinking.
they're thinking, yeah, and then, so it is this is why I think it's an opportunity, actually, is because people are now thinking they can start seeing an answer, they're feeling of a problem, and they're seeking an answer, they just don't know where to go. Or at least that's part of it. It's not all bad. It's what it is, but chatbots are increasingly, that like YouVersion, who in here uses YouVersion? I bet a lot of people do, yeah. Out of Oklahoma City, 1 billion downloads. It's great. You know, it's something that's really being used well. But if I want to ask advice about faith, do I want to talk to a chatbot? Is that where I really want to get my answer? I don't need, people, AI experts can't even tell you where they're getting the answers from.
At least they're asking the question.
Yeah, some people are
That's a
asking
good
questions.
thing.
Yeah.
And I see on the news that Gen Z is attending church like never before. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And I think some of them are probably motivated through AI and other things they see on the internet.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's all bad. I'm just saying what it is. What it is right now. And for instance, that stat's really interesting. Gen Z is attending church more than ever before. But the decline in Gen Z has been so drastic that where they start from is a very low bar. So some of those things can be a little deceptive if other pose. So what I need is a Jesus that is unimaginably powerful. If I'm going to fight these dependency dealers who I know are very, very powerful, they never before has the array of opponents lined up like this. I need to have a Jesus that's unimaginable. Now, what does unimaginable mean? Mitch, what does unimaginable mean in the original language? You just quoted it this morning. Unimaginable means unimaginable. So this is why we talked about hyperology a few weeks ago. We need to start thinking in ways that are not limited. And especially as we talk about Messiah as we go along, I'm going to show you what that means. He does exist. Now, to him who is able to do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine, according to his power that is at work within us, that's Ephesians 3:20. So rather than give you over the next 4 weeks a perfect description of Jesus Messiah, we're going to talk about what he's like, what he's more than, because it's very limiting to just say exactly what he is. So when I use that language, give me a little grace because I want to go to that language. Has anybody ever heard the term your Jesus or my Jesus? We don't use that in Church of Christ as much as some churches do. We say, oh, let me tell you about my Jesus. When I hurt, he counsels me. Yeah. Or my Jesus, I know when I die, I'm going to get to go to heaven. Now, those aren't wrong. They're just very limiting. And as I've been taught to say, so limiting and incomplete as to be wrong. They're not wrong. They're just have that, especially in America, where we think in terms of individualistic rather than community. And I'm going to eventually try to show you Jesus Christ, Jesus Messiah can only be understood fully in terms of community. That's how he's meant to be, and that's how the Bible shows it. So when Peter said in the Great Confession, you're the Messiah, the Son of God, we'd all raise our hand, right? We all believe that. Okay, now somebody stand up and tell me exactly what that means. Like, we just know it, but what do we know? And so for the next bunch of weeks, we're going to talk about what does that mean? And why is it not obvious? So now I'm going to give you some history. Everybody in here loves history as much as I do. Positive history. My wife tells me everybody's as interested in the things I am as I am. To tell the truth, that's actually the title of this was to tell the truth. Anybody remember to tell the truth? You gotta be at least 70 to know that. The go, it says, Ralph D. Emerson was a rocket scientist for NASA when they first started. And then they'd all pretend like they were Ralph, and then at the end, the one real Ralph would stand up, and the movie stars was like idiots because they couldn't guess which one it was. So we're going to talk about, will the real Messiah stand up? So we're going to talk about, what does the real Messiah mean? Jesus started his ministry in about 30 AD, somewhere plus or minus a few years, 30 AD. Probably he spoke in Aramaic or Hebrew most of the time. Aramaic was a language very much like Hebrew, but it was created more when the Jews were in Babylon. So people around the Middle East, Aramaic was their native language. But when the Jews talked in religious things, they would probably use Hebrew. So Jesus's teachings were initially probably in Hebrew. So the word Messiah in Hebrew means the anointed one. And then we're going to talk about shortly in Greek, the anointed one is Christos or Christ. So literally, we're going to show they're the same thing. So when you think about the first 20 years of Christianity, virtually everybody was a practicing Jew. Every Christian was a practicing Jew. Even Paul, he's toward the end of his life, he's still going to the temple, still making sacrifices. They are practicing Jew. The language would have been, among the early Christians, would have been Hebrew and Aramaic. Okay, that's what they would have talked in. So anytime you're looking at a teaching of Jesus in the Gospels, that when Jesus said something, he would have spoken that in Hebrew or Aramaic. Then in about 50 AD, so 20 years or so later, that's when the church starts going to the Gentiles. That Gentiles are non-Jews. Most of the Gentiles don't speak Hebrew. Some of them speak Aramaic, most don't, but they all speak Greek. So starting at about 50, the terminology starts combining Hebrew and Greek. And they go back and forth. And you can see this even in the book of Romans, where Paul's talking to the Hebrews and the Greeks, the people who speak Greek, going back and forth, trying to get them to meld. They're trying to get them to come together. So for about 50 AD to 67 AD, actually, I'm going to use that, 67 AD, the term Christ and Messiah would have been the same thing. They would have used that interchangeably. Now that's also happens to be when the New Testament's written, in that same time period. And the New Testament's written in Greek. So typically the writers would have used the word Christ. And so when you're reading it through, it almost always has Christ, but in some cases, that's not what would have been said or used. Great Confession being one. Would Peter have said Christ or Messiah? Messiah, 100%, no doubt about it. You start seeing that in some of the versions of the Bible. One of the versions I like to use sometimes is the New International. The reason I like to use it, that's where I first started memorizing verses, was in the 1984 version of the New International. And I memorized at one time a lot of that. That's how I visualize those verses. In the new version of the New International Version, they start putting in the word Messiah instead of Christ where they think it's appropriate. So when I first learned this verse, that we're talking about the Great Confession, and many of you have probably learned it, it says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Now, this is last year when I started studying messianic prophecies, like, well, you can't do that. You can't just change that word. That's a pretty big deal. But they did. And both of them have a footnote. The first one's had a footnote down to Christ, and the second one, or to Messiah. The second one, newer version, has Messiah footnote down to Christ. It says they're the same thing. Now, I'm an engineer and I'm pretty skeptical when people tell me things like that. It just doesn't seem to me that Messiah and Christ are on the face of it exactly the same thing. Now, I got to the answer while the New Testament was being written. I think it was. I'm good with that. What happens in 67 AD? Well, so that's 50. 67 AD is when you have the first Jewish revolt against the Romans. Now, it ends up in 70 AD that we're all familiar with. And 70 AD is when the temple's destroyed. And when the temple's destroyed, basically Rome kicks all of the Israelite, or all the Jewish people out of Jerusalem. And a lot, the ones they don't kill, they kick out and they disperse them. So starting in 70 AD, the Jews go from being a favored people. Let me back up one step. They were favored because they didn't have to do emperor worship and they didn't have to serve in the army, among other things. So the Jews go from being a favored nation to an unfavored nation. Before 67 AD, the Christians are like, we're associated with the Jews. We get to have their same privileges. In fact, in Corinth, the ruling from the magistrate was, I don't see any difference between those two. But now after 70 AD, the Christians are going, we don't really kind of want to be associated with you guys anymore. First of all, there's fewer of you than there were before, but now the Gentiles are taking over the church. And so literally what happens is the Jews and the Old Testament teachings start receding in the rearview mirror. And the church gets taken over by the Gentiles. Now that may not sound like a big deal, except the Gentiles are mostly steeped in Greek philosophy, Greek teaching, Greek society, Greek values. And so their viewpoint is we will learn to understand about Jesus through the New Testament, not the Old Testament, and through what we already know from Greek philosophy of values. So the whole idea of Jesus Messiah as they would have seen it prior to 67 AD kind of goes on the shelf. That Messiah is kind of like the insects in the amber. That's Jesus Messiah. Now we start studying Jesus, or we start worshiping Jesus Christ, because that's the Greek word for it. Now, it might sound historically, does that make sense? It does if you go look at the early church fathers, if you go look at even by the first council at 325, when they're trying to make Christianity the official religion of Rome. Go look at what comes out of that. They're only worried about the comparison of Jesus the Son to God the Father. What is the substance of that? It has nothing to do with Messiah. It's completely lost. Now, that gets us to 325. Christ is now defined, just kind of circularly referencing inside of the New Testament. And we go through the next 1700 years to get till now. What happens in those 1700 years? A lot, right? You start having the Catholic and the Orthodox Church, you have essentially the Reformation, you have the Renaissance, on and on and on, until we get to 1960 that we talked about. 1960 America is really important, and now we have individualism that takes over. So the Christ that we worship in America, and I'm not saying everybody in this class is that, they're saying just generally, we have a Christ that has been modified from then till now. And so what most people have in America is a vision of Christ that fits their backgrounds, their experiences, what they've been taught, what church they grew up in, what society tells them, on and on. So that we have, yes, if you ask me about my Jesus, that's probably well phrased. I can tell you about my Jesus. Now, the problem with that, and Wayne, I haven't forgotten you, I'll get back to you in a minute. The problem with that is I need an unimaginable Jesus to fight this war. That's the unimaginable Jesus Messiah. I don't know that unimaginable Jesus Messiah. Or at least I didn't. I think I'm doing better now. A year ago, if you'd asked me, I'd said, sure, I know Jesus. I've been going to church 50 years. I know exactly who Jesus is. But if I'd asked everybody in this class about Jesus, I'd have got 100 different answers. Now, what are some of these kinds of Jesuses that we have? And I'm gonna drop down. By the way, Mitch is going to come up here at the end, so he gets to. And this is the one point I want to make. If I don't have a completely powerful vision of Jesus Messiah, then I'm going to be devoted to something that's not powerful enough. Now that sounds a little dramatic, but that's the problem. I have to get to where I have a vision of Jesus Messiah that's so powerful that my family and I can defeat the dependency masters, or we're going to lose the war. That's how important this is. Now, what's different about this than any other time period in history is we've never had to be that committed before. Our enemies were not as powerful as they are now. The power of the enemy, the power of the idols is multitudes more than it's ever been. So my vision of Jesus Messiah has to be more powerful than it's been in the past. He hasn't changed. He hasn't changed. It's just my understanding. Here's some types of Jesus that Americans, especially Tulsans, have. Transaction Jesus. If I do the right things, especially if I believe the right things, if I raise my hand and said I'm the believer's prayer, whatever, I get to go to heaven. Here's the transaction. I do this, I get to go to heaven. And I can't tell you how many people I know who believe the whole purpose of going to church and believing in Jesus is so they can avoid hell and go to heaven. And that's the extent of it. Now that, I'm not saying that's wrong. Don't get me wrong. That is true. How's that going to help me get through the next 5 years? That what transaction Jesus allows me to do is go to heaven after I die. But I'm hopefully going to be living in most of you for the next 5 years. I need a Jesus that helps me get through the next 5 years, not just somebody that gets me to heaven when I die. Grace Jesus. Well, even if I don't do those things that get me to heaven, he has lots of grace, so I still get to go to heaven. So I get to combine transaction Jesus and grace Jesus. My Jesus is the Jesus I've constructed. And in the book that Kyle's writing, he actually starts with the same metaphor that it's his brother-in-law used at the last men's conference, was build a Jesus, just like build a bear. I constructed Jesus that meets my every need. So one of the ways you know which one of those messiahs he has is when you think about Jesus, is he there for me or am I there for him? If he's there for me, he's probably my Build-A-Bear Jesus. If I'm there for him, he'd probably be more the Messiah we're talking about. My favorite is King Charles Jesus. King Charles is a great example of a king in the world. When we think about kings, totally symbolic, has no authority at all, but you still call him king. That's the kind of king that many of us have when we talk about King Jesus. We are happy to call him King Jesus. But we think about him and act as if he's King Charles, not the king that has total control over my life and the world. Another one is unconditional Jesus. This is one that many of my friends have. He loves me no matter what I do, say, or think. And because he loves me, I'm going to go to heaven anyway, because that's my definition of love. So these are 4, and in the book, when you eventually get it, a bit more in a minute, Kyle does a really good job of laying out a whole list of kinds of Jesuses that Americans have. Do any of those Jesuses deserve or require my complete devotion? The answer is no. They really don't. How do I know that? What's the absolute proof that that's true? Because I'm not 100% devoted. I look at church attendance statistics. In America, they've just been plummeting down every year. Statistics prove it. Just people are not devoted because they don't have that kind of trust and understanding of what Jesus Messiah is. And one of the ways that we talk about it in the book is, I'm willing to trust Jesus with my afterlife, but I'm not willing to trust him with my next 5 years. That's where we have to do, where those answers should be both. Because that's the Jesus we need to find. So, I'm excited about the book. One of the reasons I'm excited about the book is because I told you we agreed to sign with Tyndall to publish the book. I got to go to Chicago this week, and they are breaking every rule that they have to get the book out by March 1 before Easter. They haven't done this in 7 years. They get the importance of trying to get a vision to people over of a Jesus Messiah that is much more complete than the one they have. They see everything that's written, and they're like, this is a view that people have got to get, and they've got to get it now. I get pretty worked up about it, you can tell. And the reason is because I think I've started get choked up just thinking about it. I've started having this vision of my granddaughters looking at me and going, Granddad, you knew I was in danger of being a slave, and you didn't do anything about it, or you didn't do as much as you could about it. You didn't tell me about it. You didn't put your resources that way. I'm not going to do that. Nehemiah 4:14. I'm going to fight. And the first place I fight is with weapons that are different than the world's. The way I fight, first of all, I've got to have a vision of Jesus as Messiah, as it's taught in the Bible. Get that down right. That's going to be the basis. That's the foundation for how we win this battle. So that's why except for next week when we have a guest speaker, except for that, the following weeks, all we will be talking about is Jesus Messiah. What does that mean? So we'll go, Mitch, come on up. I'm sorry.